The origins of jazz history began some 400 years ago, in the 1600s. At this time, England, France, Spain, Portugal and Holland were competing with each other to control the slave trade. Millions of Africans, mostly from Ghana, Togo, Benin and Nigeria, were captured and transported away from their families and homelands. They were taken to the Caribbean islands and Spanish colonies in Central and South America, and later to British North America. The slaves were then sold, then forced to work, often in atrocious and inhuman conditions, treated merely as possessions. They were no longer free people. They were often beaten and frequently died from overwork. Because the slaves had come from different countries of origin in Africa, they spoke many different languages and had different ethnic traditions and beliefs. They also came from countries in which musical traditions were very diverse and had a long history. By 1750, there were a large number of African slaves in British North America, 240,000 people. Almost 20% of the population. There was also a small population of free black Americans, many of whom lived in the state of Maryland. The slaves used to work on the sugar, cotton and tobacco plantations, while the British owners made huge amounts of money selling the various crops. With the profits they made, they were then able to buy newly invented machinery for their factories in England and make further large amounts of money there too. By the end of the 1790s, European slave ships each year were bringing as great a number as 50,000 enslaved Africans to America. In the city of New Orleans, founded in 1718, which was controlled by the French, not the British, a free mixed-race people called Creoles lived alongside white people and slaves. These were the children of the French white slave masters and enslaved African women. They were often educated in the finest schools, trained as musicians and allowed to live in white society. Many of the French slave owners would free their slaves, especially the Creole children, but only just before the slave owners themselves were going to die. However, when the Spanish took over New Orleans in 1764, the Creoles lost all their rights and were forced to look for work. Many became travelling musicians, and it was through these musicians and their descendants it is thought that some of the roots of jazz were born. In the plantations, the slaves sang spirituals, work songs and blues, which the travelling musicians performed in their concerts. In the early 1900s, ragtime music and New Orleans jazz, latterly known as Dixieland jazz, developed from a fusion of the blues, spirituals and various European musics. Its magical quality captured the hearts of millions of Americans, both black and white, alike. Pioneers like pianist-composer Scott Joplin, known as the King of Ragtime, pianist Jelly Roll Morton, blues singer Ma Rainey, and composer W.C. Handy, called Father of the Blues, paved a road on which many others would travel. Joplin's sheet music was sold to millions of Americans who wanted to play it on their pianos in their homes. Scott Joplin became the first African American to be a famous celebrity performer. Although slavery had been abolished by now, between 1910 and 1940, nearly 2 million African Americans left their homes in the southern states of America to look for work and to get away from the harsh racism there. They moved to the northern industrial cities like Chicago and New York. As they travelled north, they brought with them the new jazz music. Some of the stars of that time were trumpet player Louis Armstrong from New Orleans and the son of a German immigrant, Bix Beiderbecke, one of the great cornet players. During the 1920s, African American music became very popular. One of the most famous performers was blues singer Bessie Smith. She was the first blues singer to be recorded and a record sold to both black and white Americans alike.
5 days in the sky turned dark as night. Then trouble taking place in the lowlands at night. I woke up this morning, can't even get out of my door. I woke up this morning, can't even get
During
out
this
of
time,
my
alcohol was made illegal in America, but secret clubs called speakeasies were originally set up in the black area of New York known as Harlem. In these speakeasies, both black and white people drank, danced and listened to bands playing jazz. Two of the most famous of these band leaders were Cab Calloway and Duke Ellington. The 1930s, generally known as the swing era, much of white America loved the jazz music they heard on their radios. An example of this would be the big band clarinetist Benny Goodman. Goodman was an important figure not only for his musical contributions, but due to his insistence in using both black and white musicians in his band. At this time, this was virtually unheard of, as most bands consisted of using exclusively either black or white musicians. Jazz music of this era became popular in Britain during World War II due to the presence of American soldiers and armed forces. In addition to the music, they brought with them dances like the Lindy Hop, and British people fell in love with the dance music of the Glenn Miller Band, which was heavily jazz influenced. Meanwhile, back in America, the Count Basie and Duke Ellington orchestras, as well as radio broadcasts, toured the country and sold millions of records. During the 1940s and 50s, many jazz musicians had become well known and travelled around the world. Jazz had now developed into a rather more complicated form of improvised music, generally known as bebop. This musical revolution was mostly developed by young black jazz musicians such as trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie and saxophonist Charlie Parker in New York City. The developments of the new music included complex rhythms, further harmonies, and improvisation. The musicians, often called beboppers, also created their own slang, clothes, and a lifestyle, not unlike hip-hop today. Since the 1950s and 60s, jazz has gone through many changes, with some of the great musicians like Miles Davis and John Coltrane, who helped develop the music through post-bop. Developments such as hard bop, cool jazz, modal jazz, all of these were generally known as modern jazz. This then led to links with other forms of music, such as rock, Latin American music, Indian and African. Jazz has also influenced pop music, hip-hop and R&B, and is found all around the world from Cuba to India, even returning to its roots in Africa.
The blues came from gospel for blues. Slaves are harmonizing them ahs and oohs. Old school, new school, no school rules. All these years I've been voicing my blues. I'm an artist from the start, hip-hop got in my heart. Graffiti on the wall, could've ended in Sparfit. Juvenile delinquent, but Pops gave me the right type of tools to think with. Books to read, like X and stuff. Cause the school said the kids had dyslexia. In art class I was a compulsive sketcher of teachers in my home.
Jazz has many heroes and heroines, too many to mention, and in all its forms is now as diverse as Africa itself.
Centimeter stories, cause Mattel's ain't tall. And I was born a rebel, mashing up these players' balls. And not for player hating, used to hate myself. And I'm not a player, cause a player's known for wealth. 6 days a week, I ate the same thing. The cornbread, mashed potatoes, and green beans. But I was told big thing for ball, cause it could be worse. So I was peace at times, and I would kick and curse. Fight, battle, and cry, laugh. Just to get by would be a pity. If this is how I have to die, felt like a punk walk around with a conqueror's name. Just searching for an itch to stake my claim. I feel free when I rock and ripping the track. And I